rain fell soft that Friday in Millhaven, Oregon. Natalie Frost stood outside a restaurant called The Hearth, 33 years old. 8 years since she last agreed to a blind date. Tonight she had, because her sister called at the wrong moment. 1 hour, she told herself. She pushed open the door and sat by the window. She was holding her water glass when a man walked in holding a little girl's hand. The child found Natalie's face from across the room and walked over and stopped at the table's edge. "You're my real mom," she said. "I remember you." Ryan Calloway had said no 3 times before he said yes. His mother Helen had the particular patience of a woman who understands that silence, applied correctly, is more persuasive than argument, and she had deployed it with the precision of someone who had been deploying it since Ryan was 9 years old and had never once watched it fail. The favor she was calling in was simple on its surface. A friend of hers had a niece in Portland, a professional woman, serious and accomplished, and Helen thought it might be good for Ryan to have dinner with someone outside the usual radius of his life. Ryan said his usual radius was fine. Helen let the silence do its work. Ryan said fine. 1 dinner. He arranged for Helen to watch Sophie on Friday evening, and everything held until Friday afternoon, when Sophie's school called to say there had been a situation involving a puddle, a classmate's lunch, and a misunderstanding about whose fault it was. By the time Ryan had sorted it out and picked Sophie up and made sense of the timeline, Helen had a prior commitment she had forgotten to mention, and Sophie was sitting in the truck, with her notebook open on her knees, asking where they were going with the alert curiosity of a child who knows that plans have changed and intends to understand why. He tried to explain. Sophie listened. She said she would be very quiet. He looked at her in the passenger seat with her dark curls and her serious eyes and the pencil already tucked behind her ear and said fine, and that was the end of the negotiation. On the other side of town, Clara Frost had spent 11 days working on her older sister. She had deployed logic first, then an appeal to the calendar, then the specific guilt of someone who is owed a favor and is prepared to name it. Natalie had said no 4 times, then maybe, then no again, then yes in the way of someone who says yes because the conversation has gone on long enough. Clara described Ryan as not your usual type, which Natalie translated as someone who would not spend the evening performing himself for her. She set conditions. Small restaurant, nothing formal, 1 hour maximum. Clara agreed to all of them before Natalie had finished saying them, which meant she had expected all of them. They arrived at the same moment, both 2 minutes late, and stood in the light rain outside the hearth, looking at each other in the way of 2 people who have been told to expect someone and are calibrating that expectation against the actual person. Ryan Calloway was tall in the way of someone who had spent years carrying things. Not the cultivated tallness of men she usually encountered in conference rooms, but something that came from actual work and actual weight. His jacket had been pressed with care. He was holding a child's hand, and the child was looking at Natalie with the wide, focused attention of someone who has been waiting for a particular moment and can see that it is arriving. They did not shake hands. They nodded. Both exhaled quietly, the exhale of 2 people who have confirmed that the person across from them is, at minimum, someone they can spend an hour with. Inside, the hearth was warm the way old places are warm, from the dark wood and the low light and the press of other people's conversations into the corners of the room. Sophie climbed into the chair beside Ryan and produced a notebook from her raincoat pocket and opened it to a blank page. The waitress brought a children's menu printed on heavy cream card. Sophie accepted it, considered it briefly, turned it over to the blank side, and began to draw. The dinner was better than either of them had prepared for. Ryan asked about Natalie's company with the specificity of someone who is genuinely curious and does not know how to pretend otherwise. He asked about the gap between what diagnostic software could detect and what overworked hospital staff actually caught in the first hours of a newborn's life, and she answered with the same directness she used when she was not managing anyone's expectations, which was how she could tell the curiosity was real. He had been in the army for 8 years, he told her when she asked. Work that did not appear in recruiting materials. He had come home with a different relationship to exits and thresholds, and the sounds that required attention and the sounds that only seemed to. He had retrained as a carpenter because it was work he could do with his hands and schedule around his daughter. Sophie drew through most of this, occasionally looking up at Natalie with the quiet, collecting attention of a child who is not being impolite but is filing information she intends to use. Ryan noticed Natalie noticing. She draws constantly, he said. Has since she was 4. He started to say something more and did not finish it. They talked about Millhaven, about Portland, about the particular texture of small Oregon towns in November. The conversation had the quality of two people who had not expected to be interested and were now sitting with that interest and not entirely sure what to do with it. Natalie found herself asking follow-up questions, which was not a thing she usually did on first meetings. Ryan answered them directly, without performance, without the self-conscious quality of someone aware they are being evaluated. He had the ease of a man who had been in enough real situations to have lost interest in performing anything. At one point there was a natural lull, the kind that falls in a good conversation rather than a difficult one. Ryan refilled her water glass from the carafe on the table without asking. A small, practical gesture, unhurried, requiring nothing in return. Natalie noticed it the way you notice the things people do when they are not thinking about themselves. Sophie ordered mac and cheese and ate it with the methodical concentration of a child who takes food seriously. At one point, she looked up and told Ryan that his jacket was the same color as the ocean, which Ryan said was true, and Sophie said she had never seen the ocean, and Ryan said they should fix that, and Sophie returned to her mac and cheese with the satisfied expression of someone who has secured a small but meaningful commitment. Natalie watched this exchange and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was the specific, bittersweet quality of watching a family that has become itself through difficulty and loss and has arrived somewhere real on the other side. Ryan Calloway was not performing fatherhood. He was simply doing it, in the way of someone for whom it had become the most natural thing in the world, which is the hardest kind of thing to become. It was near the end of the meal that Sophie set down her pencil. She looked up from the menu she had been drawing on and looked directly at Natalie with the clear, undeflected gaze of a child who has made a decision and has arrived at the moment of it. "You're my real mom," she said. "I remember you." The table went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the restaurant going quiet. Ryan's face went the color of chalk. He said Sophie's name and put his hand on her shoulder with the careful steadiness of a father who has learned that certain moments require steadiness before they require anything else. Sophie did not look away from Natalie. She reached across and picked up the menu she had been drawing on and placed it flat on the table between them. It was a woman, standing beside a rain-streaked window, platinum blonde hair, a particular posture, tall and composed, the weight carried slightly forward, a blue coat. The drawing had the careful, specific imprecision of a child who has drawn the same face many times and has memorized it the way you memorize something you cannot afford to forget. It looked exactly like Natalie. "I've been drawing you for 4 years," Sophie said, as though this explained itself. Then she lifted one finger and pointed toward Natalie's left ear. "You have a scar there, behind your ear. You fell off your bicycle when you were little." Natalie did not move. Behind her left ear, under her hair, there was a thin ridge of scar tissue she had carried since she was 7 years old. A fall in her grandmother's driveway in July, 3 stitches. She had not thought about it in years. It was not the kind of thing that came up. The candle between them wavered. Ryan was watching her with the full attention of a man who has learned to read situations when available information is incomplete. He had been a father long enough to know that some moments are more honest than any explanation you could bring to them. "How do you know that?" Natalie asked. Her voice was professionally even. She had built that voice over years of board meetings and investor calls and conversations specifically designed to unsettle her. Tonight, it was the only part of her that was holding together. Sophie looked at her with the patient expression of a child waiting for an adult to arrive at something the child already knows. She was not frightened. She looked like someone who has been carrying a piece of information carefully for a long time and is relieved to have somewhere to finally put it. "I know lots of things," she said. "You keep something small in a velvet box. You don't like the smell of hospitals even though you work near them. And there's a name you gave someone once that you've never said out loud since." Ryan spoke to Natalie quietly, with the weary care of someone who has told a version of this story before and has never found the version that fully accounts for what Sophie does. "She had developed a habit of knowing things since she was 4, he said, things she had no way of knowing. He had spoken to her pediatrician. Children, in her situation, sometimes developed complex inner narratives about their origins. It was not unusual. It was important to listen without reinforcing or dismissing. He had listened. He was still listening. He said all of this while Sophie arranged the salt and pepper shakers into a configuration that satisfied some private geometry and waited for the adults to finish. Natalie asked to see the notebook. Ryan passed it across. She opened it slowly. Every page was filled. Buildings. A dog at the park, Ryan rendered with great affection and approximate accuracy. And then, recurring throughout, the same woman, platinum hair, gray-blue eyes, a particular way of standing that Natalie recognized with the disorienting clarity of seeing yourself in a photograph you did not know existed. At a window, at a desk, simply a face, drawn again and again with the patience of someone who cannot afford to forget. In the older drawings, rendered in the rougher lines of a younger hand, there was something on the woman's left wrist, a thin bracelet, imprecisely drawn but unmistakably there. On the left wrist, Natalie closed the notebook and set it on the table. She said she needed a moment. Sophie nodded as though she had anticipated this and found it entirely reasonable. Outside, the mist had thickened slightly. Natalie stood beside her car in the lot behind the restaurant and put her palm flat on the roof and breathed. The metal was cold. Millhaven continued its Friday evening in absolute indifference to what was happening to her. A car passed on the road. Music from somewhere down the block, low and ordinary. She was 25 years old again, in a hospital in Eugene, Oregon, and the room was very bright. A biomedical engineering student at the University of Oregon, a relationship shorter than it should have been and longer than was wise. A man who, when she told him, said he wasn't ready with the composed calm of someone who had rehearsed it. Her mother, Margaret, had listened to everything and then scheduled a series of conversations that were not really conversations. There had been talk of Natalie's future, her real future, the one that had been planned and invested in and would not be undone by a single mistake. Natalie had refused. The way you refuse something when you know it will cost you everything, and you refuse anyway because the alternative is not something you can do. The birth had been complicated. There had been interventions. There had been a point where Natalie had gone somewhere she could not describe, not unconscious exactly but absent from herself, and when she came back, the room was quieter, and a doctor she did not recognize stood by the bed and spoke in a careful, measured way about complications and outcomes, and how the hospital could handle everything with dignity and care. She signed the forms they gave her. She went home. She lay in her apartment for 3 days, looking at the ceiling, and then got up and finished her degree and moved to Portland and built something out of the absence. Because building was the only alternative to not building, she had named the baby in the 7th month, alone in her apartment with her hand against her stomach. Aurora. It meant dawn. The thing that comes after the longest dark. She had bought a silver bracelet from a jeweler on a side street in Eugene, delicate, engraved with the name in small letters she had to squint to read. She had laid it on the nightstand where she could see it. She had carried it to the hospital. She had not carried it home. She had found it 3 weeks later in the pocket of a coat she had not worn since, wrapped in a piece of the receipt from the jeweler's, as though someone had been careful with it. She put it in a velvet box. She had held it twice in 8 years. She could not wear it. She could not put it away. Sophie Calloway had been born on the 9th of February. Natalie had given birth on the 9th of February. She had not gone looking for that number. It had simply appeared when she turned over what she already knew. The way a stone turns, and what is underneath has always been there, waiting for the light. She heard the door open behind her and did not turn around. Ryan stood a few feet away. He had the quality of a man who understood that some silences need company and not conversation. "Are you okay?" he asked. She turned. She looked at him in the parking lot light. "What hospital?" she said. He told her. She closed her eyes. She told him she would explain. Not tonight. She asked if they could meet again soon, before she lost the ability to say what she needed to say. He looked at her steadily, with the careful, evaluating attention of a man who has spent years in situations where reading people correctly was not a skill but a necessity. He said yes. They went back inside. Sophie had arranged the salt and pepper shakers into what appeared to be a crescent moon and was examining it with visible satisfaction. The waitress brought the check. Ryan paid. Natalie let him, because she was somewhere else entirely, moving through the arithmetic of a calculation she had been making since the moment a child pointed to a drawing on the back of a menu. She drove home through the mist without turning on the radio. She sat in her kitchen, the only room in her house that felt like somewhere a person actually lived, and opened the velvet box on the table. The bracelet was small and light, the engraving unchanged. "Aurora." She set it beside her phone and did not put it back in the box. She did not sleep. In the morning, she called Patricia Owens, her attorney, who answered on the second ring even on a Saturday. Natalie explained what she needed. Patricia asked 3 precise questions and said she would begin immediately. Then Natalie drove to Eugene alone. She took the long route through the valley. She needed the time and the low gray sky and the particular silence of a drive you have to make yourself. She let herself go back to the hospital room, to the lights and the monitors and the face of the doctor who spoke in a carefully rehearsed way. She had been 25 and alone in a room that smelled of antiseptic and February cold. She had signed what she was given to sign. She had not asked enough questions. And she understood now, driving south through the valley with both hands on the wheel, that she had not asked enough questions because someone had made certain she wouldn't. The records office at the hospital was staffed by a quiet man in his 50s who processed her request with the methodical neutrality of someone who has spent years retrieving sensitive documents and learned that neutrality is its own form of kindness. He found her admission records, the labor notes, the interventions, the physician's report, the death certificate for an unnamed infant filed under her name. She looked at the death certificate for a long time. Then she asked about other admissions to the same ward on the same night. There had been a second infant, female, admitted at 4:17 in the morning, 40 minutes after Natalie had lost consciousness, transferred at 7:42 to a private nursing care agency before documentation protocols were completed. The transfer authorization had been signed by a physician whose name appeared in no other official hospital record she was permitted to access. The agency was called Pacific Sunrise Infant Care, dissolved in the state registry 11 months after the transfer. No forwarding address, no trace. There was a handwritten note misfiled inside a maintenance request for the same ward, same date, archived without anyone reviewing its contents. 2 lines. Infant responsive, good color. Query transferred to, and then the ink dragged, smeared. The sentence unfinished. She photographed every page. She sat in the parking lot while an ordinary Saturday morning moved around her. Families arriving, a porter crossing the painted lines with an empty wheelchair, the world going about its business, with the complete indifference of a world that does not know what has just been found in a misfiled folder. She called Patricia from the car and described what she had found. Patricia listened without interrupting, then said she would begin the formal records audit by end of day. Natalie then called Howard. a forensic document examiner she had used in a corporate dispute 2 years before, methodical and reliable. A man who always underpromised and always delivered early. She described the transfer authorization. She asked him to cross-reference the signature against State Medical Board archived records of licensed physicians in Oregon at the time of the transfer. Howard said he would have an answer by Wednesday. She drove back toward Portland in silence, already knowing what she was going to do. She needed the evidence to hold the weight of what she had already decided. Ryan texted the morning after the dinner. Short and careful, without expectation. Last night got a little strange. Hope you're doing all right. Natalie read it 3 times. She told him she was fine and would be in touch soon. She did not say more, because what she needed to say required his face and a table between them. In his workshop on the edge of Millhaven, Ryan Calloway sanded a cabinet door and tried not to think about Natalie Frost in the specific way he was already thinking about her. He had spent most of his adult life in environments where thinking about the wrong thing at the wrong time had consequences, and he had brought those habits home and they served him well most of the time. Sophie had asked that morning if Natalie was coming back. He said he didn't know. Sophie nodded with the patience of a child who has been given a non-answer and has decided to wait it out. She picked up her pencil and opened her sketchbook without another word. He watched her from the doorway for a moment before he went back to the workshop. There was a cabinet door that needed finishing. He picked up the sandpaper. He thought about the drawings. He had a folder on his phone of perhaps 60 photographs taken over 4 years, not systematically but occasionally. The way you document something when you sense it matters in ways you cannot yet name. He had not shown the folder to anyone. He had not known how to explain that his daughter had been drawing the same woman since she was 4 years old, and that last Friday he had walked into a restaurant in Millhaven and seen her sitting by the window. He remembered the February morning he and Jessica had brought Sophie home, cold and very clear, the kind of morning that feels almost too still. Sophie had been wrapped in a yellow knitted blanket, small enough to fit inside the crook of one arm. Jessica cried the whole drive home. Ryan held Sophie for 3 hours that evening and did not put her down. Jessica had been gone for 2 years now. A car accident on the interstate, a Tuesday morning, Sophie 16 months old and Ryan in the workshop when his phone rang. He had stood very still for a long time before he moved. He kept going because Sophie was there, and Sophie needed him to, which is the most straightforward reason in the world and also the truest. It was Diane who had found Sophie originally. His younger sister, a nurse in Eugene, constitutionally unable to pass a problem without trying to solve it. She had received Sophie through the hospital system when the infant arrived without documentation, her file incomplete in ways that had been flagged and then quietly cleared by someone with the authority to clear them. Diane had begun adoption proceedings. 7 months later, a truck ran a light on her morning walk to work. Ryan had sat across from the adoption attorney 2 weeks after the funeral, still wearing the tie he had bought for the service. The attorney said Sophie would return to foster care unless a family member came forward. Ryan said, "She is my niece. I am coming forward." 14 months followed, and 3 home assessments, and most of what he had saved, and a social worker named Gail who looked at him the way an engineer looks at a bridge before trusting it with load. At the end of it, Sophie was his. She was 18 months old, with dark curls and a focused, precise way of watching people's faces that was sometimes unsettling and always honest. He learned to braid hair from instructional videos, achieving a level of competence that Sophie accepted with diplomacy. He gave her everything he had. He would not apologize for any of it. Natalie called 4 days after the dinner. She needed to come to his house, she said. She needed Sophie to be somewhere else for a few hours and would explain when she arrived. Her voice had the quality of someone who has made a decision and is moving through the steps of it carefully, not from uncertainty, but because the decision itself is large enough to require care. He said yes, arranged for Sophie to spend Saturday morning with Helen, and cleaned the kitchen, which was what he did when he did not know what else to do with his hands. Natalie arrived at 10 with a leather folder under her arm and the composed, contained expression of a CEO walking into a meeting she is prepared for and is still afraid of. She sat at the kitchen table. She placed the folder flat in front of her. She looked at Ryan, and then she told him everything. She told him about Eugene, about the biomedical program, and the man who said he wasn't ready, and her mother who called it a situation to be managed. She told him about the birth and the doctor she did not recognize and the forms she signed in a room that had gone very quiet in a particular way. She told him about the physician whose name appeared on one document and nowhere else, about Pacific Sunrise Infant Care, dissolved 11 months after Sophie's transfer, registered at an address that turned out to match the office of the Frost family's private attorney. She told him about Howard, who had confirmed 2 days ago that the signature on the transfer authorization matched no licensed physician in Oregon at the time. She told him that Sophie's birthday matched, that the hospital matched, that the scar and the velvet box and the name she had never spoken since the night she chose it were not things Sophie could have known. She opened the folder and set the documents between them. Ryan was quiet for a long time. He sat with his forearms on the table, his hands still, his face doing the careful and contained work of absorbing something that demands absorbing before it can be responded to. Then he asked, "Are you sure?" She said yes. He stood, walked to the back door, and stepped outside. Through the kitchen window, she watched him stand on the porch in the gray November morning with his back to the house. 15 minutes passed. The coffee in her mug went cold. She did not move. He came back in. He sat down across from her. He looked at her with the open expression of a man who has made the most important decision of his life and is no longer in the process of making it. "She's mine," he said. "Not a challenge. The simplest kind of fact. Whatever the results say, she has been mine since she was 18 months old." "I know that," Natalie said. "She loves you," he said. "She has loved you for 4 years, from a picture she made in her own head. She doesn't need to lose a father to gain a mother." "No," Natalie said. "She doesn't." They looked at each other across the kitchen table. Outside, the November light came through the window at a low and patient angle. "What do you want?" he asked. "Not what you think is fair. What do you actually want?" She had not been asked that question in a long time. "I want to know her," Natalie said. "I want to be someone she can call. I want to know which foods she won't eat, and the name of her best friend at school, and be there when she needs someone who isn't her father. I want to be part of her life." Ryan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That sounds like a family." "Yes," she said. "I suppose it does." She was still at the table when the front door opened. Helen came in first with a canvas bag and a comment about something she had seen at the farmer's market. Sophie came in behind her at a run, yellow sneakers loud on the hardwood, and stopped in the kitchen doorway. She looked at Natalie. Natalie looked at her. Sophie crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and wrapped both arms around Natalie's waist and held on with the full, uncomplicated conviction of a child who has been waiting for this and has not wasted any energy doubting it would come. Nobody in the room said anything. Helen set her bag down quietly. Ryan looked at his daughter and then at the window, and the kitchen was very still. 3 days after that, Natalie drove to Salem. Her mother's house sat on a quiet street on the south side of the city, behind a deep front lawn and the kind of mature landscaping that accumulates when people stay in one place for a long time and tend it carefully. Margaret Frost opened the door herself. No housekeeper in sight, which meant she had sent them home, which meant she had been expecting this conversation and had wanted no witnesses. She was 61 years old and had aged with the deliberate intentionality of someone who treats time as a project to be managed. Navy trousers, a silk blouse, small gold earrings. She stepped back to let Natalie in without a word. The living room was exactly as Natalie remembered it. Light through tall windows, flowers arranged with mechanical precision. A portrait above the fireplace, oil on canvas, some ancestor observing everything with the tranquil authority of the permanently uninvolved. Margaret sat across from Natalie with the composed posture of someone who has been sitting very straight in difficult rooms for many years and has not yet needed to change the habit. "I think we should skip the part where you express surprise," Natalie said. Margaret considered this. "What would you like me to say?" The truth would be a start. The room was still. Margaret looked at Natalie with the expression Natalie had catalogued over a lifetime. Not cold exactly, which was what people assumed, but managed. Her mother was not a person who felt nothing. She was a person who had decided, at some point in her own history, that feelings were a resource to be allocated carefully and never spent in the moment. "You were unconscious," Margaret said finally. "The complications were real. But the infant survived. Dr. Harlan has been the family's physician for 30 years. He understood the situation, and he understood what needed to happen. The documentation was handled." "Handled," Natalie said. "You would have kept her. You would have left school, left every plan, with no money, no partner, no support. You were 25 years old. You made a decision for your reputation." The words landed and did not echo. Margaret absorbed them the way she absorbed everything, with a stillness that had cost her something once and now cost her nothing. "I arranged good care," she said. "The placement was vetted. The child was healthy and placed with a good family. Her name," Natalie said, "was Aurora. The family that raised her lost 2 people in 4 years. She grew up without a mother in her house, and she spent 4 years drawing my face because she knew, on evidence no one could explain, that I would come back for her. She is 8 years old. She is already better at love than you have ever been." Natalie stood. She picked up her bag. She looked at her mother for a long moment. "The way you look at something you have decided to stop carrying. There will be a formal investigation," she said. "Whatever comes of that, I want you to understand one thing clearly. You will not be in the same room as my daughter." She walked out. The door closed behind her, not with force, but with the quiet finality of a door that has been closing for a long time and has now finished. The DNA results came on a Thursday morning. Natalie was parked in the garage beneath the Novaborn building, engine still running, when the email arrived. She read the report once, sitting very straight. Then she sat with it. Not because she had doubted it, not for a single day of the days since the restaurant, but because confirmation is its own thing, separate from belief, the specific moment when what you have known becomes what you can prove. She called Ryan. "It's confirmed," she said. Her voice was steady. He said, "I know. They told Sophie on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the blind date that had not been what either of them had expected. It was the kind of November morning that follows a week of rain and carries a quality of light that is thin and honest and clean." They sat on the back porch of Ryan's house with Sophie between them on the wooden bench, her sketchbook closed in her lap. The yard was quiet. The maple tree at the fence stood bare and patient. They told her the truth in the terms that belong to an 8-year-old, which is to say, all of it, without its most technical parts. There had been a mistake, a long time ago, before she could remember. Natalie was her birth mother, her first mother. Ryan was her father, and would always be her father, and nothing about that was changing. Simple words, because the truth, when it is the right truth, does not need to be complicated to be true. Sophie listened with the focused, collecting attention she brought to everything. When they finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the yard. Then she turned to Natalie. "I kept drawing you," she said. "So you would remember how to find me." Natalie felt something she had been holding for 8 years let go quietly, the way ice gives way in early spring, not with a crack, but with a slow and inevitable yielding, the way things release when they are finally ready to. "I'm sorry it took me so long," she said. Sophie considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "It's okay," she said. "You're here now." Natalie took the small velvet box from her coat pocket and held it for a moment before she opened it. Sophie leaned forward and read the engraving carefully, the way she read everything, giving it the attention it was owed. "Aurora," she said. "It was the name I gave you," Natalie said, "before everything went wrong. It means dawn." Sophie looked at the bracelet for a moment. Then she said, simply, "I know. I always knew." Natalie fastened the bracelet around Sophie's small wrist. It was too large and would need adjusting, but Sophie held her arm up and examined it with the satisfied expression of someone receiving something they have been waiting for and are glad to find it real. Helen came through the back door then, quietly, carrying a folded bundle of fabric in both hands. She had the expression of a woman who has decided that now is the right time for something she has been keeping. She set the bundle on the bench beside Natalie without a word. It was a blanket. Yellow, knitted, worn soft from years of washing. The blanket Sophie had been wrapped in on the February morning Ryan and Jessica had brought her home from Eugene. Helen had kept it in a cedar chest in her spare room for 8 years, against no particular plan, against only the kind of feeling that has no name but refuses to be dismissed. Natalie touched it. The specific yellow of it. The weight of the knit in her hands. She had not known she would recognize it. But she did. She recognized it the way you recognize things that were given to you before you had the language to receive them. Before any of the architecture of the person you would become had been built, this was what had gone home with her daughter. This was what her daughter had been wrapped in when the world began. Ryan sat beside her and put his hand on her shoulder, briefly. The way you touch someone when words are not the right instrument. Not a promise or a declaration, just a hand on a shoulder in the morning light, which is sometimes the most honest thing one person can offer another. Sophie slid off the bench, settled cross-legged on the porch step, and opened her sketchbook to a new page. She worked without hurrying. After a while she turned the book so Natalie could see 3 people sitting in front of a small house. The lines careful, the proportions generous, drawn the way a child draws the things she loves. Below the drawing, in the rounded and deliberate print of a child still working out the full relationship between letters and meaning, Sophie had written 2 words, "Our family." Natalie looked at it for a long time. The maple tree stood bare at the fence. The sky above the yard had the thin, clean quality of a sky that has finished raining and does not yet need to decide what comes next. She thought about the 8 years she had spent building Novaborn around the problem of small lives in their most fragile hours. The diagnostic tools, the early detection software, the hospital partnerships, telling herself and everyone who asked that it was about systemic gaps in clinical efficiency. All of that was true. None of it was the whole truth. The whole truth was sitting 3 feet away, on a porch step with a pencil in her hand and a silver bracelet that was slightly too big on her wrist, drawing the family she had always believed was coming. Then Natalie reached over and tucked a loose curl behind Sophie's ear, the small and ordinary gesture of a person who is learning, one moment at a time, what it means to stay.